Thanks, Talia. Thanks. I'd like to add my thanks that everyone's been giving to all the generous funders of this conference and to the Strauss Institute, which has actually been an important partner of ours for a long time, and I'm always delighted to be here. Had a chance to be here before. And I'd like to add my congratulations to the winners of the News Challenge. Good job. And also to, I guess, thanks and congratulations to the non-winners who are here, but good, important projects, many of which I know about. This is an amazing gathering, actually. In fact, it seems to me a really interestingly various bunch of people in this room. I don't want to stereotype you or simplify the list, but educators, organizers, self-described geeks and nerds, reporters, sort of experienced reporters, communication students entering that business, public servants we've just heard from, funders. It's really an amazing group. I think a lot of people are coming from quite different places when I just hear the conversations. I think for some people, parts of this discussion are immediately what they live and breathe, data administration, for example, election administration. For other people, that's the first time they've ever heard about it. They're living every day with, let's say, teenagers and teaching them about civics. So there's really quite a variety. And I suppose the real theme of my remarks is the real need to pull that together, that actually that work is complementary. It does take some translation. I suspect some people are just really not even getting some of what's being talked about, but I really think we have to pull it together. And we have our work cut out for us. Talia just mentioned Circle, which is civicyouth.org if you're not following us on Twitter. And we just today report that the turnout of young Americans in 2014 was 19.9%, the lowest ever recorded, significantly lower, statistically significantly lower than in 2010, the previous midterm year. I would say, without going into a whole diagnosis, it was a lousy year from a nonpartisan perspective. Everything from the new voting laws that were in place to the way the campaign was covered to the way youth were reached was a lousy year. But I do think we can do better, and I think we can do better if we pull this community together. We know 2016 will be different, at least in some ways. As you all are fully aware, we're in the beginning of the presidential cycle, that biennial, it's both biennial and biannual, ritual of American politics. Every presidential cycle in some ways is a great civic ritual for our country. Alas, only about 60% of adults vote in those years, even in the best years. But a national campaign still reaches a lot of people. 60% of the population is a lot of people, and it touches many more. It challenges us as a country to consider fundamental issues facing us for the next 4 years. And it connects back to our political heritage as a nation, because many of the great moments in our political history have been these presidential elections, which have changed the course of the country. So let's pause for a minute and ask ourselves, as the 2016 election heats up, what should we expect from this great national civic experience? What do we have a right to expect from this civic ritual? And I would say, first, the campaign must engage all Americans without respect to their wealth, their social status, their race, their age, their gender, their disability, their political and religious opinions. It must engage all Americans. It must give all Americans equal weight, equal importance, honoring the fundamental principle of one person, one vote. It must make our leaders accountable to us as equal citizens. More than that, the campaign must provoke a serious conversation about the most fundamental issues facing us as a country. It must enlist our higher instincts. It's absolutely fine for citizens to hold on to diverse political ideologies. We certainly are going to continue to disagree, and that's fine. And it's fine for us to hold on to our various and conflicting interests. Self-interest has been pointed out before today. But we all must be reminded in a presidential election cycle of at least the more generous and idealistic aspects of our own views and interests, what Abraham Lincoln called, right after the fateful campaign of 1860, the better angels of our nature. During a national political campaign, Americans must have respectful interactions with fellow citizens who hold different views from their own. The goal of those interactions is not consensus, but some mutual understanding, some awareness that we are all legitimate participants in one great political system and one great political debate. I think some of our interactions must be personal in the sense that we get to know one another and can actually reply to each other's ideas. Whether online or face-to-face, I don't care, but where there's a personal connection. It's not enough to relate to politicians and other famous people, celebrities, by following what they say. We must also relate to one another. The barber shop in Philadelphia is a model. Citizens must also see ways of acting on their political values that go beyond casting a ballot in November, important as that is. Several speakers have said that. If you're moved by the problem of climate change or you're concerned about moral decline, the campaign should inspire you to reduce carbon or to restore traditional values in your community by working with neighbors and peers. The act of voting should be one, but just one, of the political efforts that you undertake as a result of the election. And finally, a diverse set of new actors must see openings to enter political life, whether as campaign volunteers and staffers or independent activists or reporters or artists or bloggers. Presidential elections are entry points for whole new generations of activists and leaders. All right, so I've described a national election in rather glowing, idealistic terms, but we all know that the reality falls far short. In fact, many of my friends and colleagues who do civic work at the local level and in nonprofit settings typically don't want to have anything to do with something like a national election. An esteemed colleague who works mostly with adolescents in an urban context in a civic education kind of program, community organizing kind of program, recently remarked at a meeting, "I have never seen anything big that's good." I've never seen anything big that's good. I think that the programs she admires are ones where human beings voluntarily relate to each other as individuals. They can act on public problems and they can see the consequences of their actions. They know the other people's names and interests. The problems that arise in these kinds of settings are usually problems of relationships, individuals being selfish or prejudiced or antagonistic. And so the solutions involve improving the relationships, talking, listening. What about a national election? It's impersonal. It's detached. It's about millions of people. It's about casting a secret ballot for a person you will never meet. The consequences of your vote are tiny, often hard to see, even if they exist. And the election is not really voluntary. Yes, it's voluntary whether you vote, but it will yield a new president and a new Congress who will govern us whether we like it or not. So if you are comfortable seeing and used to seeing politics as impersonal, as things like mass voting by secret ballot, then I recommend that you pay some attention to the settings where citizens do come together to talk and work voluntarily in tangible ways. That's what I would call the relational basis of American democracy, and it's in weak shape. We need more of it and better. You should help support dialogues and deliberations, community organizing, civic education in schools and out of schools, community service programs that may not be fully political, civic journalism, new media efforts that bring people into dialogue. The movement to expand those programs is what I would call, and a lot of people would call, civic renewal. And it is important. For one thing, those efforts are what creates the demand for the kinds of information that many of you in this room produce and gives citizens ways of acting on the information. So I think one of the debates or conversations that have been rising both in the breakout groups and online and on Twitter is, will people want the information that we're producing? And I think, roughly speaking, the answer is, well, yes, if they are engaged with their fellow citizens in civic life in a more everyday way. Kate brilliantly argued that earlier this morning. I agree with everything she said about that. And her work underlines the importance of social and personal interactions for politics. That was actually her third of 3 points. So among the grantees, I would point out groups like Up for Debate Ohio from the Jefferson Center and certainly Sharp Insight in Philadelphia. And among other folks I know in this room, it would be groups like the McCain Challenge in Chicago or Generation Citizen, which work with kids on relationships as well as on participation in their community. People like those and many others, I don't mean to imply that's all the people in the room who do that. People like that are busy at the grassroots level, helping their fellow citizens to discuss issues, to develop relationships, to work on important issues and problems. They are quietly rebuilding our civil society. But here's the question. Where can those activists for civic renewal get large-scale leverage or impact in a nation of 300 million that has very rigid institutions? How can they change our large-scale politics to reflect more of their values, their relational values? Well, one possible answer would be during a presidential campaign. In fact, when the 2008 presidential election was first heating up, when we were about the same place that we now are on the 16 cycle, but in 2008, I think many of my colleagues who work in that grassroots civic renewal saw openings to bring their work into national politics. This is in 2008. Why did they see openings? Well, first of all, both parties had competitive primary elections that year, so lots of the presidential campaigns were basically startups. They were eager to incorporate newcomers as volunteers. There were pathways to become paid staffers for new people. They were eager to experiment with new tools and methods. Many of today's younger, not very young, but younger civic activists cut their teeth working for a 2008 presidential candidate. And because many of those campaigns were long shots to begin with, they were willing to try risky strategies that empowered their grassroots volunteers. They allowed robust discussions on their websites that weren't scripted or controlled, even though they could be seen by anybody. They let their volunteers develop strategies and methods that would work in their own communities. And several of the campaigns offered genuine ideas about how to take civic engagement or civic renewal to scale. John McCain advocated a dramatic expansion of civilian national service. He joined Senator Obama in New York City in Lower Manhattan on the auspicious and politically precious day of September 11th, 2008, when he could have been doing something else, to call for the tripling of AmeriCorps. That was a policy idea for enhancing civic participation in America, and it, of course, fit in a larger and authentic message that connected to John McCain's service in uniform and as a prisoner of war. It's mostly forgotten now, but John Edwards, during his relatively brief campaign, was committed to having a national citizens' deliberation on an important policy idea that would generate an official result that would go before Congress for an up or down vote. So it was a different kind of policy proposal to have a national conversation, also, in my opinion, quite promising. And Barack Obama. Barack Obama spoke about the citizens' role in politics, in my opinion, with more depth and commitment in that election than any presidential candidate since Bobby Kennedy in 1968. That's my judgment, it's my opinion, you may disagree, but I've tried to write about it and collected many of his quotes on that topic. He made civic renewal a signature theme in his rhetoric, and he developed various appropriate policy proposals, transparency in government, expanded national service, quite a few. And meanwhile, his campaign embodied his message of civic engagement in the way it organized itself. Grassroots volunteers were no longer asked to reach certain numbers of voters with a scripted message. That wasn't the way they kept them accountable. Instead, they were trained to form relationships with people in their communities and to develop their fellow citizens' leadership skills. They were given the power and authority to create their own messages. They were held accountable for the number of true relationships they built. It was a great example of a mix of the relational politics that we know from the grassroots and from voluntary settings with mass politics. And it carried Obama all the way to the White House. So now I ask the question, is the 2016 election another source of leverage for civic work, another opening for grassroots people to improve American democracy? Well, on the day after the election, which will be November 9th, 2016, certainly some people will be happy. A candidate whom they admire will be the incoming president of the United States. I understand and appreciate their enthusiasm. I don't want to rain on their parade. They will have worked for a cause that they believe in. They will have won it fair and square. And yet, I think most of us, regardless of who wins, will reflect back on the 2000 election and say, that was a And here I struggle for a word that I can use in the polite setting of the University of Texas forum here. That was a, shall we say, disaster, fiasco. They may express themselves privately in a stronger way. I think that measured by all of the criteria that I mentioned when I started talking about what we should expect from an election, this campaign will probably look like an almost absurd failure, a travesty. Will all Americans be engaged? Will they count equally? Absolutely not in an election cycle expected to cost $5 billion. A few individuals will personally contribute amounts in the hundreds of millions, and they will certainly count for more than you and me. Candidates are openly boasting right now of their success in lining up big donors during what is openly and proudly called, but ridiculously, the money primary. The campaign battleground will be small, limited to swing voters in swing states and to very few competitive congressional districts. In vast states like Texas, voters will be seen, not by me, but by the political system, not to matter much at all. Will new people bring new ideas and energies into campaign politics? Not, I fear, through the presidential campaigns, because the leading candidates on both sides are the opposite of startups. They are extremely experienced professional operations with little room for newcomers. I know there are startups. I don't think they're going to make it. And while the innovations of the 2008 campaign involved empowering volunteers to develop their own messages and strategies in human contact, the main innovations since then have involved the use of big data to hone and test messages sent from campaign HQ to citizens. The whole point of these methods is to affect individuals in reliable and predictable ways, not to hear their views or empower them to act or remain in touch with them after Election Day. The value of algorithms and data is rising. The role of volunteers is increasingly trivial. Will we see a great conversation about the fundamental issues facing the country? I'm sorry to say that also seems unlikely to me. In every modern campaign, so many factors direct the conversation into trivialities and distractions, not to mention fear-mongering and outright lies. Look no further than the way that every tweet by Donald Trump right now dominates the daily political news, at least among the sort of official political news. And this year, there's an additional, subtler reason to be skeptical about the national conversation. Realistically, I'm just going to be very frank about this. Realistically, a Democratic president will not be able to accomplish a domestic policy agenda in her or his first term because Congress is almost certain to be controlled by Republicans. So the most she or he can actually accomplish is to veto Republican legislation and negotiate the annual budget more or less to the status quo. That means that the Democratic candidates must talk about what they would do if elected, knowing that they actually cannot do very much at all. So all the rhetoric from one side of the campaign is going to ring basically false, which is not good for the discussion. Republicans can be more genuinely ambitious, but it remains to be seen whether any of them will put forward a fully serious conservative platform. Incidentally, I think the same situation applied in the 2012 election when Barack Obama faced a Republican Congress, and that struck me as one of the least edifying dialogues of modern times. Remember, the televised debates between President Obama and Governor Romney were dominated by each man saying, "You propose X," and then his opponent saying, "No, I don't." They never got to talk about what they actually did support or talk about the pros and cons of what they did support because they were both blocked from actually saying it. The whole conversation was incredibly confusing and misleading, as we found actually when we surveyed young people. Will the 2016 campaign touch the better angels of our nature, call us to work together on important problems in our own communities outside of voting? I hope so. I certainly hope so, but again, I'm not terribly optimistic. Much of the $5 billion that will be spent in this cycle will be used to frighten and distract, not to inspire and empower. Politicians always overpromise what they can deliver and try to persuade us that they will solve our problems for us. That's their job. It's always a somewhat disempowering message because it says we're important, you're not. It'll be worse than usual this time because few Americans really believe that national leaders can achieve anything significant, given the frozen political situation in D.C., so the candidates will relentlessly exaggerate their own potential and thereby minimize the role of ordinary citizens. I was asked to inspire you. They emailed me and said, "Would you come down and speak?" And I said, "Sure, what about?" And they said, "Well, would you please inspire them?" So from your laughter, I can tell that I am so far doing a utterly miserable job and getting in trouble. I'm painting a very depressing picture of the months ahead. But I actually do intend an inspirational message, and I mean it seriously, and I believe in it. Imagine again that it is November 9th, 2016, the day after the national election. The official campaign, as waged by professional politicians at the national level and covered by the mass media, is more or less as I have predicted. It's a civic nightmare. But imagine that Americans do not wake up on the day after the vote and remark, what a ... disaster. Instead, imagine that they say, this is the year that we, the people, reclaimed our political system. Yes, the candidates ran multi-billion-dollar campaigns using scripted, misleading messages to influence a few swing voters and to demobilize their opponents through fear. But that's not the main story of the 2016 election. Despite the behavior of the candidates and their enablers among the donor class and the mass media, this election actually was a great discussion of fundamental issues. It actually did reach most Americans. It did inspire us not only to vote, which we did, but to act in other ways to improve the world. We learned about each other. We gained a measure of respect for our fellow citizens who disagree with us. We saw at least the dim outlines of true solutions emerge. We saw a role for ourselves in achieving those solutions. For the time being, we still expect relatively little from Congress, at least for the next few months. But we expect a great deal from ourselves as a people. We are ready to step up to our responsibilities as a great self-governing nation. Why would that happen? In all seriousness, it would happen because of your work. It would happen because you have labored and innovated and collaborated. You have built apps and websites where citizens can genuinely discuss issues or use the data to genuinely discuss issues with people who disagree. You've covered news in ways that bring out the real issues and engage diverse voices. You've empowered some of even the most disempowered Americans with tools and ideas and skills that reconnect them to politics and civic life. Now, none of you can accomplish that alone. The budget of each organization represented in this room is a tiny fraction of the weekly spending of one of the presidential campaigns that will be flooding the airwaves with fear and misinformation. But we can accomplish a great deal together and with the many willing allies who don't happen to be here with us today. We need to find new ways to set common goals and collaborate effectively in our communities, in states, and at the national level. We have to combine the grassroots relational work, the education, the community organizing with explicit political work, relationships with information and data, newsrooms with barbershops, with City Hall, with startups. We have to pull it together. In Bolivia, just this last month, Pope Francis reflected on the impasse among political elites at the global level, not the US level, that he said is putting not just the US, but the whole earth in danger. And he said, he concluded, people and their movements are called to cry out, to mobilize, and to demand, peacefully but firmly, that appropriate and urgently needed measures be taken. His last words were, the future of humanity does not lie solely in the hands of great leaders, the great powers, and the elites. It is fundamentally in the hands of peoples and in their ability to organize. It's fundamentally in the hands of peoples and in their ability to organize. I think those are great and timely words. We are unlikely to hear them in very serious ways from the presidential nominees, but we can make them the inspiration for our own efforts. This is the year that we can take back American politics. It's up to us. Thank you.